All right. I am now joined by Nathan Robinson, Dr. Robinson, I believe, since last
Oh
time
yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Congratulations, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you. I now have greater credibility on any subject on which I pontificate.
Absolutely. Um, and just make sure people always refer to you that way, like Dr. Kissinger.
Thank you, Dr. Burgis.
Yeah. But yeah, I actually remember the night before I defended going, sitting at a bar with a friend of mine, trying to think of how many fictional characters who were always referred to as Doctor weren't supervillains. That's which I guess Kissinger would be a real
I'm
life.
fine with being a supervillain.
Fair enough.
I'll lean into that.
Well, in any case, um, Nathan is of course the founder and editor of Current Affairs magazine and the author of many things, but most recently, I think, or I this is one of the most recent. It's the one I'm going to talk about. A article that was co-written with Dr. Noam Chomsky. What do we owe Afghanistan? So it's sort of off topic, but sort of not for tonight. But you want to tell us what that article's about?
Well, the Afghanistan war is often spoken of still as a kind of noble failure. Barack Obama sort of saw it as the good war. The Iraq war is the bad war. That's the one that's the crime. We didn't all denounce that. But the Afghanistan war was, we did it for good reasons. And Chomsky had been saying this for a long time, that we, in fact, did not have good reason to invade Afghanistan. And the war was, in fact, a crime against the Afghan people. So we lay out the case for that. It's one of a series that we're doing together. Is going to be one on Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And there's also going to be, we're hoping a book is going to come out of it, tentatively titled The Myth of American Idealism, because the central theme that is going to run through these pieces is that in every case of, and this is a theme that's run through Chomsky's work for 50 years, is that in every case of some disastrous, horrible U.S. crime, even when you lay out all of the terrible facts, there is an excuse that is made that, but our intentions were good. And one of the things we want to show is that actually our intentions are often things like vengeance, bloodlust, the pursuit of our own power. And these are not, in fact, praiseworthy or justifiable intentions.
Yeah, right. There is this, disturbing thing where even in a lot of liberal, foreign policy rhetoric, the worst thing that you're allowed to acknowledge about American foreign policy is that it's a mistake, right? Mm-hmm. That's the range.
Doesn't go
right?
well.
Yeah, it goes from we have we do things that are they're great, and we do things that are misguided or mistaken, but we never do anything that's like a crime. Like that's for other countries, right? So when Vladimir Putin orders an invasion of Ukraine, nobody has any trouble seeing that as a criminal act of aggression and not a well-intentioned mistake. But somehow parallel reasoning is not applied to anything the United States does. Well, all right. Well, I like many things about that, even above the fact that that I once co-wrote an article for you, so that's pleasingly few points of connection there. But
6 degrees of Noam Chomsky.
yeah, exactly. But I'm glad you mentioned Vietnam, because that gets us to the subject for tonight, right? So this debate we're going to watch is from 1966, and it was one of the first episodes, I believe, of Firing Line. I think it's like number 3, and it's this. So it's William F. Buckley, of course, who is the sort of founding thinker, writer of like modern American conservatism as we know it in many tellings of that story. Who is, I always actually the very first debate breakdown we ever did back when we were doing them on Sunday nights on this channel was of Buckley's debate with at Oxford. It was at either Oxford or Cambridge with James Baldwin, and so this is like right at the height of the civil rights struggle, on which Buckley, in his more like shameless moments, was just like frankly on the wrong side, and then in his more evasive moments, it was unclear, and I told you this. We were talking about this before, but I mean this. That debate contains my all-time favorite William F. Buckley moment, which is when he's sort of posturing about, well, look, racism is bad, of course, but I mean, what are we supposed to do? And Cambridge student, calls out for the audience to heckle him and says something like, well, you can let them vote in Mississippi. And he says, I'm not going to try to do the William F. Buckley drawl, but like he says, well, if it were up to me, most of the white people in Mississippi wouldn't be able to vote either, which is very...
Well, that's an honest admission of the underlying values of American conservatism.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, look, I hate all the common people,
Yeah. There's a whole book on that debate now. The publisher sent us this whole. I think The Fire This Time is about Baldwin and Buckley's clash as this sort of illuminating event for all of race relations in America. So it's a fascinating two people to the two. If you want to think of the 20th century intellectuals that couldn't be further apart, you'd love to see clash. It's James Baldwin and William F. Buckley.
Totally. And and I will say, like, one of the very few nice things that I'd have to say about William F. Buckley. Well, I can think of two nice things to say about William F. Buckley. One is that he was a better writer than any of the people who try to imitate him now. I try to. I'm not Matt McManus. I don't force feed myself like 20 of these books a year, but like or you for that matter.
Me, yeah.
But I try to read a few conservative books in a year to just kind of keep myself honest. Know what they're saying. And I remember when I read Buckley's book God and Man at Yale a couple of years ago, and just before that, I'd read Ben Shapiro's the fuck is that book called? The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose made the West great. And I have to say, like, compared, like, just purely like on the quality of the writing, right? Like, compared with Ben Shapiro, that's like reading William F. Buckley is a pleasure, right? I mean, that's like, he's every bit as evil, right? But but it's just painful reading Shapiro. I mean, not that I have to tell you. I know that you've read more Ben Shapiro in your life than I have. I think I've read like several reviews of that stuff, but that's one thing. And then the other thing I'll give Buckley credit for, you said like, okay, this. He's the person you'd most want to see him clash with. Well, Buckley, to his credit, and also unlike a lot of his latter day successors, actually, was very willing to talk to leftists. Norman Thomas, we're going to watch tonight. There's Michael Harrington, which I watched with Rob Larson. Like
Huey Newton.
Huey Newton. Yeah, exactly. Like he was actually as willing to talk to whoever as a lot of these people now just sort of pretend to be.
Yeah, although it wore off as the ascent of Reaganism took place. As the firing line episodes are more and more conservative guests. So in the 60s and the 70s, with the New Left. He was sort of forced into it a little bit by the times. The fact that his brand of conservatism was very much outside of the mainstream when he got started, and they were on the offensive, and then when once the Reaganites took over, he was like, oh, I'm not talking to leftists anymore.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Oh, and Chomsky, of course. We did that one
Chomsky.
too.
And have you seen Chomsky's not obituary for William F. Buckley, but when they asked him after Buckley died to give some comments about him?
Oh no, I haven't seen this.
Oh, it's incredible because they say, "Oh, what are your thoughts on the death of William F. Buckley?" And Chomsky goes, "It's like the most vicious thing you could possibly say because it's so dismissive." He goes, it's something like, I haven't seen it in years, but he goes like, he hosted a television show. He was considered, not by me, to be very learned and witty, and he keeps going like, other people consider this. I did not. I had no respect for him whatsoever. But for some reason, it's basically like, for some reason, people were interested in what he had to say, and like that's his obituary.
Yeah. Well, before we do Norman Thomas and the subject of the debate, I guess one last comment about Buckley that I guess you'd appreciate is, I remember, so Christopher Hitchens has this book called, I think, depending on whether you're looking at the British or American edition, it's either Blood, Class, and Empire or Blood, Class, Nostalgia. And about the Anglo-American relationship, and I just remember in there him complaining that people thought that William F. Buckley had a British accent. He's like, that's not what that is. What are you people talking about?
Well, no one has the Buckley accent. People call it Mid-Atlantic, but it's not even Mid-Atlantic. It's just a Buckley. It's just Buckley voice.
Oh, fair enough. Well, so the person he's talking to in this case is Norman Thomas, who, again, I mean, in terms of people who, in terms of like people, it would just be unimaginable to see a lot of contemporary conservative pundits, talking to the equivalent of, not that there is a direct equivalent of now. I mean, let's start us up with, who is this guy for anybody who's not familiar?
Yeah, so I mean, Norman Thomas, basically one of the leading socialists of the early to mid 20th century, and became notable anti-war activist, and the Socialist Party presidential candidate. He was the perennial candidate who took over after Eugene V. Debs, and I think in the election immediately after Debs. So there's a real he's a real relic from history. He's very old at the time of this particular debate, which is why it's kind of incredible. I think it's in the last couple of years of his life.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I think I was thinking about what to say about Norman Thomas, right? I mean, so yeah, this is the guy who's, this is the guy who's running. I mean, like, he's running against FDR, right? From the left. In fact, famously, I think he had a line about the New Deal when people, greatly exaggerated the case, but because of those, kind of sort of social democratic reforms that made it into the New Deal, that he said, somebody said something like, Roosevelt has carried out your platform. They said, he's carried it out on a stretcher, meaning that, like, he sort of saw these as stepping stones towards a, socialist society. And that's obviously not what FDR, was interested in. And I know, actually, I'm not sure. Do you know exactly when Thomas died?
1968.
1968. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, which is interesting, thinking about the Socialist Party, right? So I think things started to crack up really after he died, but yeah, he has another of his lines that he's famous for, is his objection, with like regard to anti-Vietnam War protests, to burning the flag, not on sort of, not because he disagreed with the protesters' point, but he thought that a better way of making it would be, he said, to wash it with soap and water. Um, but yeah, so that's who Norman Thomas is, and what they're debating is the topic is Vietnam, stay in, leave, or escalate. And this is in 1966, so I mean, it is right in the sort of the curve of escalation. Is going crazy, right? This is like when LBJ came in, after the Kennedy assassination. He started to, he was, there was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is a very sanitized way of putting what
non-incident.
What's that?
Or non-incident.
Yeah, the Gulf of Tonkin non-incident, right? Famously, that it was seemed like at one point there was this American ship that was being attacked and that it wasn't, but then they still ran with it, as an excuse to escalate American involvement in Vietnam, which since that started out as mostly a matter of just providing military support to the right-wing dictatorship in South Vietnam, and advisors that of which there were many, and the line between an advisor and combatant is unclear, right? But like theoretically, the United States wasn't exactly directly involved in the war, which and then there's this incident where people thought at one point that an American ship was being shot at, that was sort of used as a pretext to get more directly involved. Which, by the way, as I'm saying that, is the sort of thought that should terrify everybody, given what's going on right now.
Yeah. No, that's right. That's right. I mean, there are important parallels with Ukraine and of course Taiwan, and because one of the other thing about the Gulf of Tonkin incident is it's first that the incident itself was exaggerated, but it's also that the U.S. didn't disclose the fact that they had been provoking the North Vietnamese through these coordinated attacks. So they had been helping the South Vietnamese attack North Vietnamese positions, and then when they were sort of chased out, we concealed entirely our role and went and just look at what the North Vietnamese do. Don't look at what we do that causes that kind of reaction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I mean, if you definitely, I just wrote something for Jacobin that came out today that, where I mentioned, something I try to mention as often as all possible because I find it bizarre how little play it gets in the media, which is that American intelligence sources bragged to the New York Times about their involvement in, covert, although I don't know how covert it is if you brag about it to the New York Times afterward, but covert operations to sink Russian ships and assassinate Russian generals, which is the sort of thing. When I say that, I mean, I think some people hear that as like, oh, I'm expressing sympathy for Russian generals or something. Not the point, right? The point is that this is exactly the kind of like indirect support shaded into more direct involvement that you can see in Vietnam and many other wars, that have happened in other places, right? There's no sharp line between that, and one can very easily lead into the other. I mean, I was writing about this in the context of Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, which was in fact such. Which even Thomas Friedman in the New York Times said was a pointless provocation that no good could come out of. So I think when you've out-hawked Thomas Friedman, it's officially time for reflection about the choices you're making. But I mean, that's another one, right? I mean, could very easily imagine that, right? I mean, that if God forbid there was a there was an actual Chinese attack on Taiwan, or even a sort of ambiguous semi-attack like these live fire drills right now, 10 miles from the Taiwanese coast in response to Pelosi's visit, that like, you could easily imagine that sort of shading into like, well, are these just really long drills, right? Is this an attempt to isolate it? If so, right, do American ships come in to, to resupply? What happens given an inevitable conflict? This is the kind of thing that, like, it's very easy to say, oh, of course I don't want to go to war with Russia. Of course I don't want to go to war with China, which is a good first step. But if you're really serious about this, right, I mean, the rest of these decisions have consequences, and like looking at the way that, previous conflicts escalated over time is, seems pretty relevant to me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 1964, this Gulf Tonkin incident, and LBJ seizes on the non-incident to sort of escalate to more direct and obvious and undeniable American involvement, and in the war. And then what's happened between then and the time they're actually arguing about this in 1966?
Well, I mean, I think I'm not sure what the troop levels are by 1966, but I mean, LBJ has deployed a large number of actual American soldiers to South Vietnam, and they have started essentially destroying the South Vietnamese countryside in the name of protecting it from the Viet Cong.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how we keep making these mistakes. Okay, so that's the context, and so Norman, Norman Thomas as is a not a not an apologist for sort of the capital C version of communism. Obviously, advocates a democratic form of socialism, but is a critic of committing genocide in the name of stopping it. Buckley, not so much. Is there anything else you think we should say to set this up?
No, let's see what they have to say.
All right.
Vietnam, escalate or get out.
Mr. Norman Thomas has run 6 times for President of the United States, and 6 times the American people, in their infinite wisdom, have declined to elect him. But they did something for him which I suspect he prefers even more than the exercise of great power. They returned their affection. Because he is a grand old man, a monument to physical stamina and good-heartedness. If I were asked what has been his specialty in the course of a very long career, I guess I would say being wrong. But somehow it doesn't seem to matter any more than it matters that Don Quixote specialized in like-minded activity, yet emerged as probably the greatest anti-hero in literary history. Mr. Thomas is a socialist and a pacifist, and his newest crusade is to save Vietnam from the United States Marines, or perhaps to save the United States Marines from South Vietnam, or perhaps to save the world from the costly displeasure of the communists who tend to stand in the way of anyone whose aggressions are directed towards them, and to treat the communists like the slightly excessive radicals at the University of California, who, if given just half a chance, would succumb to Mr. Thomas's overwhelming charm. But Mr. Thomas is a man of militant idealism and outspokenness, and is therefore lucky for the entire world that he was not born in Russia. His charm, which wins over practically everyone, would not, I fear, greatly have affected the Bolsheviks. It is the highest tribute to Mr. Thomas that he would have been bloodily executed in the very first purge conducted by the Soviet Union. Mr. Thomas,
it's a hell of an introduction.
1,000 books and made 1,000,000 speeches, and I hope he will live to write another 1,000 and speak another 1,000,000 times. Always provided his audiences continue to love him, but patiently and determinedly to reject his counsels, as they have done so often in the past, particularly in the realm of foreign policy. He has said that he likes the human race and is very glad to be a member of it. The human race, for whom I presume to speak just this one time, reciprocates the compliment, Mr. Thomas.
I thought we were going to debate Vietnam, not to discuss me and my life and work and miracles.
You've been brilliantly introduced.
As a matter of, I doubt it, but I would point out that while I have not achieved many of the things I cared most about, I have come nearer hitting the nail on the head of what the people would adopt later than most candidates for president or other office. I'm no Don Quixote tilting at windmills when I was the pioneer on so much social legislation as the country now has.
Well, let's put it this way:
I've never been engaged simply in the delightful game of throwing darts at whoever's working, as some of the other people that I know have been doing, and I'm fairly content, not fully by any manner means, but fairly content with a number of ideas that I have seen at least partially adopted, even by Republicans. So many of them that you couldn't even stay a Republican. I think that's quite a fair record. As for the rest, it's my charm. This is the debating tactic.
Now, don't make a liar out of me, Mr. Thomas.
This is the debating tactic. Oh, I'd be very glad to make a liar out of you if necessary.
Okay, proceed.
It wouldn't hurt you at all. See, after all, I've been around a long time, and it's an old trick to kill an opponent by kindness. After all, he's a poor old man.
Are you quite
he still
dead?
has some charm, don't you know? But wrong up here. So, having said all that, and
you see what I mean?
I've known you to do it before. You take superfluous time on remarks not related to the subject in hand, which is a large one. Why don't you tell me this time?
I think you're a very large subject in hand.
No, I'm not. Vietnam is a subject in hand. I've been treated by even life. I haven't got around to your paper yet, but except incidentally. I suppose that now would be a good time for you to start out and tell me what you think about how far you'd escalate the war in Vietnam.
As far as is necessary to win it, and no further at all.
All right, go right ahead and describe.
Well,
the next steps.
You know, after reciting the glorious achievements of your career, you perhaps neglected to specify that you've identified yourself very proudly, I think, as a socialist and as a pacifist. And we are not a pacifist nation, for which I thank God, and we are not quite yet anyway, a socialist nation, for which I'm also grateful. But as regards South Vietnam, it seems to me clear that you have certain difficulties in talking about it, because after all, you are a pacifist. And under the circumstances, you have got to despise any kind of military action anywhere, don't you?
Wait a minute. You ought to be better informed. I was a religious pacifist of a fairly absolute sort in the First World War. I was, for philosophic reasons, which I was obliged to abandon.
May I interrupt you, sir, because we have
a
queue over here.
Well, I just want to make it plain that if you're going to keep talking about my being a pacifist, I am not a pacifist in that sense anymore. I hate war.
You're proving quite belligerent tonight, but we have to go off the air for just 1 second.
Oh, all right.
Thank you.
I have seen several of these, and this is the first one I've ever seen where Buckley's introduction of the guest is like, 5 minutes about how wrong they are.
His one of David Susskind is so bad that Susskind says, I need to point out how rude and insulting the introduction you have just given me is. Yeah, sparks flying already here with Noam Thomas.
Yeah, I do like that, Buckley is doing all that, and Thomas's response is this irritation that he just does not have time for. It's like, okay, whatever, let's talk about Vietnam.
This old man's not going to take Buckley's shit. He's seen this before. Don't praise my charm.
Exactly.
He's like, I know what you're doing. Talk about Vietnam. I love him. I love him already.
You were saying, Mr. Thomas.
We'll save time if we get this passage straight. I wish I did believe, and for the same reasons, believe all that I believed at the time of the First World War, but for various reasons, immaterial now, I didn't. For instance, I supported the loyalist government of Spain in war. I certainly supported the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, constructively and critically, but supported. I supported reluctantly the Korean affair, our side in that. So you're wrong in saying that I am obliged to object to all wars. I object to this war for its own particular reasons. I object to war. Let me say this for one thing. The passion of my life almost is that my country should lead in finding alternatives to war now that my country has led in making war so indescribably deadly by the use of the bomb.
Well, so somewhere, though, in your hierarchy of ambitions is also freedom, I know. And the question is, of course, can you always have freedom without, if not war, the threat of war? And what are we talking about in South Vietnam? I heard you once say something rather extraordinary. It was recently. You said, yes, the Soviet Union and the communist nations will keep a treaty if it is to their interest to do so in order to prevent war. Well, doesn't this presuppose that the alternative of war has got to exist?
I don't
and
remember,
isn't it precisely that alternative?
I don't remember saying just to prevent war. I said that that people, including our own country, keep treaties, unfortunately, pretty much as they accord with their interest. Ask the Indians of the United States how we kept treaties.
Correct. And therefore, it's got to be to their disinterest to prosecute war. How are we going to affect that?
We're still talking around the subject. The subject is Vietnam as it is, and what I want you to say is what you think you're going to do by escalating the war, what you mean by winning. And I'll tell you why we can't win, why we're fighting a cruel, inhumane war and a very stupid war. We never should have been drawn in it, and we should get out. That doesn't mean that we can decamp tomorrow at 10 o'clock, but it does mean that we can stop sending boys to a country where the most recent demonstrations have had at least a strong tinge of anti-Americanism in Saigon and other cities which are still in the hands, supposedly, of our Vietnamese allies. What I am concerned is for a ceasefire, the beginning of negotiations, and other things that I'll talk about after I see what you mean to do.
After you finished asking your question.
Go right ahead. Now,
Well,
tell me, get as far along as I've got.
In the first place, I hope to do much better. In the first place, Mr. Thomas,
it's always
escalation is a relative thing. We have escalated considerably over what we were doing a year ago, and a year ago we had escalated considerably over what we had been doing a year before. Somebody once said, somebody told me that if I voted for Goldwater, we would escalate the war. I did, and we have. So there is no question about that. There is no question, but escalation has been going on right along now.
I do just want to pause there to note that Buckley is doing the same thing here to Noam Thomas that we saw him do in the one with Christopher Hitchens that you and I watched, which is that he's doing these random digs at Democrats, right? In this way that's like, okay, like, for anybody who didn't get what he just said, right? To spell it out, the idea was, well, LBJ ran against Goldwater kind of as a peace candidate, right? That he ran these ads saying that that Goldwater was reckless and he was going to get us into a war with Russia and all this stuff, and then Johnson himself escalated like crazy in Vietnam in very much the kind of way that people were worried that Goldwater would. But it's like, how is that supposed to be like you're debating Noam Thomas?
Yeah, right. What the thing that he has just said, what of what meaning is it? What value is it in addressing the points that Thomas has just made?
No, exactly. It's like it has nothing to do with anything. It's like, it's like, yes, right. Lyndon Johnson, the guy who's prosecuting the war that I came here to argue with you about, sucks. Yes, agreed. Next, like what on earth is the point? I do also think that that I do wonder, by the way, if that said, I mean, it's a much more defensible version because it's actually relevant to the point they were arguing about. But I do wonder if Norman Thomas was getting a little side dig at Buckley when he was listing off wars that he had been willing to, he'd been willing to abandon his previous commitment to pacifism to support. That the first one he mentioned was the Spanish Civil War, because I think Buckley, I believe, was famously, pretty soft on Franco.
I undoubtedly, but it is worth noting that Buckley. I mean, that first answer. I mean, you kind of a better example of just being flat wrong. Right? I mean, Buckley does not seem to have just gotten bad information about Norman Thomas, where he said you are obliged because you are a pacifist to not support this war. I mean, and Thomas just goes, "But I supported World War II. I supported the Spanish Civil War. Like, what are you talking about? Like, are you talking about the position that I had in World War One, which was an understandable position in World War One?
Yes." Yeah, no, absolutely. And then despite that very clear, refutation, Buckley is, you notice that like what he was doing right afterwards, he was just like plowing on with what he'd been planning to say on the assumption that Norman Thomas is an absolutist pacifist. He's, starts talking about, well, I mean, are people going to keep treaties without at least the threat of war? It's like, none of this is relevant anymore, right? He just told you.
Said, like, he believes in the use of military power when it's necessary, but it's not necessary here. So we have to talk about the specific circumstances of Vietnam rather than some, absolute condition.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like, what he keeps, I know I just kind of stopped in the middle of the segment because that the LBJ thing was just so astonishingly off point. But but like what Thomas keeps trying to draw Buckley into here is like, okay, tell me how this scenario where the U.S. just sends enough troops to quote unquote win, right? What does that look like? Right? Because
right. He's doing a good job of getting us on the right question here. Right, because that is the ultimate point, is that there was no way to do what Buckley said should be done.
Yeah, exactly. Because because the war, was being fought in 1960. It changed a little bit late. The dynamics of the war were a little bit different later on. But I mean, certainly in 1966, there was no like, there were no North Vietnamese fighters in South Vietnam, right? It was all South Vietnamese people fighting South Vietnamese people and also fighting Americans, right? That's so like there's no, it's not even like a scenario like the Korean War, which parenthetically I should say was really bad, but like it's not a scenario like the Korean War where there's an invading army you could just repulse, right? The point of the war was to suppress a guerrilla insurgency against a deeply unpopular government, right? I mean, like that's not something, the idea that there's this like clear cut point where it's like, well, you're just like any problems you're having are just sort of strategic military problems that you can solve by having a better battle plan or like sending more troops, just kind of misses the point.
If your question is, has the moment come to saturate North Vietnam with hydrogen bombs, I would say no. The moment clearly hasn't come, and let's hope it never will come. The point is to constantly increase the pressure in order precisely to cause the North Vietnamese to desire to abide by the terms of the treaty which they flouted so soon after signing it.
This, of course, was shared by us. We didn't sign it, but we should have. I want to give a little history, and I'd be glad to give a little connected story instead of just darting here and there. The whole history is a history which makes us about one of the last nations who should have butted into this primary civil war. We did help the nations toward freedom in Southeast Asia, except Vietnam. I talked, as did many other people, with delegates who came after the Second World War. They said what they wanted was freedom. And they weren't all, if they told the truth at all, by any means all communist at that time. They were supporters of Ho Chi Minh, with whom we had been allied in fighting against Japan. We not only did not do anything for the independence of those colonial peoples, we financed France's war to hold the Indochina provinces to the tune of at least $2 3/10 billion, or about 80% of the pecuniary cost. They then got out through a deal worked out by the nations at Geneva. We were present as observers, but we did not sign. We did not observe the treaty as it was made. We began to send aid, as was not contemplated, military aid, very early, at least as early as North Vietnam, and a great deal more of it. When it came
If
to
I may say
56,
so, Mr. Thomas.
wait just a minute, and then you can say a lot.
Yeah, you got 9 years to go, though. I'm getting a little fretful.
56, I guess that's right, I have, and you wasted a little of the preliminary time, and that's why we're not getting to the heart of things.
I never think it's a waste of time to talk about you.
You know, these things, if this is an exhibition in smart remarks, it's all right, but if it's a serious discussion of a very cruel war and what we're going to do about it, we're wasting time. And you are too well informed.
Tell me about uncruel wars and stop all
I'll
these
tell you about
evocations.
relatively uncruel wars.
You've just given history as written in a snake pit. It would probably take a generation of historians to untangle the 2 or 3 paragraphs that you had just finished reciting so apodictically.
It doesn't take
So
2 or 3 paragraphs.
We attempted. We did not.
Did we or did we not support France?
We did not. And I'm very glad.
Or did we not? Well, let me go on.
No, wait a minute. Please don't.
Did we or did we not?
Please don't proceed as though you had just made a cosmic breakthrough by simply reciting to me something I've known since 1954. The reason we didn't sign the treaty was because such irresponsible right-wingers as Hanson Baldwin of the New York Times wrote the day it was concluded, quotes, "The communists have scored another major victory in the struggle of the world." Or the New York Times, writing 1 year later in its editorial section, said, "The Geneva Agreement terms have not been carried out in good faith, and indeed only the blindly optimistic would have supposed that they could be." Now, we didn't sign that treaty because it was a lousy treaty, Mr. Thomas. That's why. What's your next point?
My point is that lousy treaty, which ought to have been better observed, even if it was lousy.
I'm all for observing the treaty, but the point is it was unenforceable.
Well,
we asked
Canada didn't even try.
and India and
Poland,
know,
and put up a mighty poor effort
in North
and
Vietnam.
rejected a plebiscite which was ordained for 56,
Mr.
and
Thomas,
which even.
May I ask you one question before you proceed? Do you believe that a plebiscite is worth anything at all unless it's freely conducted? Because you do realize, don't you, that the North Vietnamese would not have conducted a free plebiscite. You realize that 1 million people fled from North Vietnam
I
to South
realize
Vietnam.
that, and that's why I think it's so funny that that President Eisenhower said that 80% would probably have voted for unity after that. I always thought that was odd. You must remember at one time I belonged to a committee that was in favor of South Vietnam. But I think the conduct of Diem, what he did, his failure to carry out any reforms, his nepotism, he created a situation in which it's ridiculous to talk about freedom there. And you talk about cruelty of wars, yes, but this is a peculiarly kind of cruelty which combines the worst of most wars. That is to say, the peculiar horror of a guerrilla war, plus the peculiar horror of bombing, which can't just destroy strategic objects. We're only going to win the war, if we win it, by practically laying Vietnam, North and South, desolate.
Well, I don't think you proved your military credentials there, but
well, I've
just been
told a man
that
who's been there for a year by Jack Longroth in the New York Times.
I know a few generals who have been there for several years.
2 Vietnamese for every Vietnam, and that's Viet Cong, and that's what we're doing. And in the end, and this, because you don't care very much about the cruelty of war.
Where'd you read that, Mr. Thomas? In one of your books?
No, from here.
We have to wait for a commercial. Excuse me, just 1 minute.
And what you said.
We have to wait just a
Okay. Well, you know, Thomas is doing again. I think this is valuable. Trying to say, it's point about firing line just being a bunch of smart remarks, but how would we actually discuss the war intelligently? And the way to discuss it intelligently is to go back and see how the war began. This was, in fact, I was just reading Daniel Ellsberg's memoir about the Pentagon Papers, and Ellsberg began in the early 60s as someone who thought the war was just unwinnable, and who thought it was a bad idea that we weren't going to prevail in Vietnam. What turned him fully into thinking the war was immoral and wrong was when he was reading the Pentagon Papers, and he discovered the whole history of the support of French colonialism. And after the war, when Ho Chi Minh was begging the United States to help the Vietnamese throw off French colonialism and become independent. And in fact, we did the exact opposite, giving the French billions of dollars to try and suppress the Vietnamese nationalists and retain their hold on Vietnam. And so I think Thomas is right in trying to go, I mean, Buckley, of course, go, oh, we don't have time for any of that history. You got 9 years left or whatever. But he's right to try and go back to the original sins that created the conflict, which is the support of French colonialism, then the support for an autocratic government to replace the French colonial government, and the failure to observe the requirement for an election in 1956 under the Geneva Treaty. Buckley, and this was often a right-wing talking point that said, oh, well, a free election couldn't be conducted in North Vietnam, so we didn't need to do the plebiscite. But the point is that if you agree that a free election could have been held in South Vietnam, why didn't they hold an election? And the entire reason is because, as Eisenhower acknowledged later, the communists would have won.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. I mean, this is why Norman Thomas, when he's, and it's funny, like after he says the thing about smart remarks, Buckley does like 10 more things that are like good lines, but have absolutely nothing to do with what they're, don't advance the argument in any way. But this is exactly why, right? Thomas is correct to say, I mean, it's funny, like, Buckley just responds to this by being like, oh, you just don't know what you're talking about with military strategy. But of course, they like what actually happened, right? That I think really bears out what Thomas is saying here, which is, look, this is the only way to, if there was a way to win the war, it would just be by flattening the country, which is exactly right. Because again, it wasn't like, North Vietnam was, providing military aid, to the Viet Cong. But there's, but like the actual fighting, was thoroughly being done at that point, I mean, started to change after the Tet Offensive, but I mean, like, by South Vietnamese people. I mean, this is not an attempt to repel an invading army. This is an attempt to suppress a popular revolution, and, Thomas is also correct to say, like, it's ridiculous to frame this in terms of freedom and liberty, because, like, okay, you have a communist dictatorship in the North, but I mean, you have a right-wing dictatorship in the South, I mean, there's no, nobody's holding real elections in South Vietnam.
Yeah. No. And, sorry, I just like the comment someone left about Grandpa don't take no crap.
That is very much the vibe here.
Good for him. God, Buckley's such an ass.
Yeah, no, exactly. I should probably turn down our volume here because I turned it up for the debate. But yeah, no, I think, I mean, I think that, Norman Thomas, is somebody who, is like, yeah, I mean, I think that he's somebody who is on the right side of, 98% of things that, that ever came up. I think that if anything, probably, right, like some people in the Socialist Party, like, other people in the Socialist Party, I think it probably erred too far in the early Cold War in sort of sympathy for, the U.S. side of that. There are a couple of references to that, that like he was part of some sort of committee for South Vietnam at one point, the reference to the Korean War. But but he's also he's also like a decent human being who's paid attention to the details and knows the history.
Yeah.
And as such, right? I mean, like he could just see this like very simple point, which is why he's like, look, yeah, don't tell me about my charm, right? Don't like, don't make smart remarks. I want to know how you think this war started. I want to know how you think it could be won,
Yeah.
because, I mean, ultimately, he's exactly right that, like, I mean, in fact, what did happen is there was quite a bit of flattening right in the years after 1966, but it still wasn't enough.
Well, I mean, even if he did not do well in this debate, and I think he's doing pretty well considering he's 82. The fact is that everything he said, the facts won the debate, because everything he said about what would happen in Vietnam, right, which is that you would bomb it until it was destroyed, and you still wouldn't win, is in fact exactly what happened. So everything he's laying out turned out to be true. Buckley lost this debate when history over the course of the next 5-6 years went exactly as Thomas predicted it would. There's another thing about Norman Thomas where I only started making this point once I read his book. I think it's Socialism Re-Examined or Reconsidered. He has a good point about where the socialism and authoritarianism, the whole knock on socialists, a bunch of Stalinists, civil liberties were. And I only started making this point, the credit goes to Norman Thomas, that if you want to look at the history of civil liberties in the United States, at the forefront of the fights for civil liberties, always the socialists. Who's going to jail? Who's fighting for civil liberties in this country? He said, especially American socialists, you cannot come after us for socialism is authoritarian, because we actually have the best record of fighting for civil liberties of any political tendency in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I believe Norman Thomas, if I'm not mistaken, is one of the founders of originally it was like the National Civil Liberties Bureau or something, but what became the ACLU. And even though he was willing to make a distinction between World War I and World War II, and support the support the war to defeat Hitler. I know he was also involved during World War II in like legal efforts to stop the internment of Japanese Americans, and it was just very, very consistent on stuff like that, on civil rights and civil liberties issues, in general, which, like, also, we know that William F. Buckley is the furthest thing from that. I mean, like, look, in this debate, he's shilling for the DM dictatorship in South Vietnam.
Mr. Thomas, you were telling about how I adore cruelty or something.
I finished that, and I based on some remarks I heard you make at Lehigh, among other things, that not cruelty in general, but cruelty is the necessary adjunct to this kind of a war. Now let's look at your main point. Your main point is that somehow we're going to contain communism this way, and we aren't. We may delay certain events in communism. We're not going to contain it.
Was the war in Greece cruel? Excuse me. Was the war in Greece cruel? Did we contain the communists in Greece?
You haven't got the same situation by a long ways.
Well,
for one thing, you haven't got Yugoslavia.
Well, for one thing, it's in a different part of the globe. That's different. Yeah,
well, proceed. Look, let me get a little farther on this, and at least tell you what you want to answer. What I am asserting is that if we win, it'll be a devastated, broken country. Probably this may happen before either China or Russia comes all the way in the war, which would be a major tragedy in the world. We would have to support what was left of Vietnam as a colony halfway around the world on the very borders of China, which can no more be done peacefully than China could do the same thing to a colony in Mexico.
Why did you support the Korean War under the circumstances?
We would postpone a showdown which would be disastrous at a time when you might still be alive, but I would be dead.
Mr. Thomas, why did I support this is sort of science fiction horror talk? Because in point of fact, if you don't mind, rather than simply automatically to accept your own vaticinations. I'd like to point out that in Korea, we did actually stop the aggressor.
All right.
It cost us many billions of dollars and 100,000 casualties.
And
But there are those, including yourself, who thought it was a heroic effort to try to keep the communists at bay. Now, is it a function of age or is it a function of what? You keep talking about the progression of your intellectual position from the time you were a pacifist then until you are, it seems to be almost nearly a pacifist again. But why did you back the Korean War and refuse this
one? Give me
one?
a chance, and I'll tell you very quickly. There's no question whatever that the Korean War was a war of aggression from the North on the South. There is every grave question that you have anything but a civil war, which both sides, our side and their side, the North Vietnam and to some extent China, and we on a tremendous scale intervened in this civil war. We acted plainly on a mandate of the UN. There was no such mandate here. The Korean War wasn't too successful, judging by the number of men we still have to create there.
Hold, Mr. Howard, please.
And
do you think there would have been a mandate for the war in Korea if it had happened that the Soviet Union was in the Security Council that afternoon in June? Come on now, come on.
Whatever the reason is.
Well, I'm giving you the reason, so please
don't
use
that reason is not valid.
reasons.
The fact that Russia was away was a very good thing, but it was with the will of the nations outside of Russia that we acted against aggression. You have no similar endorsement now.
Of course, we have similar endorsement. We have it from England. We have it from
you
the
have it from
the
individual nations, but to know the France, the country that once claimed to own them all, is very critical of what we've done. And outside of governments, there is a degree of criticism of this war in the world that is very damaging to our repute.
Do you want me to explain the reason for that, Ms. Thomas?
You want to explain it?
Yeah, would you like to hear?
Yes, I'd like to hear.
It has to do with a certain infection that comes to societies that tend to shrink from the realities. And it is an infection that causes, unfortunately, people to lose all sense, all moral understanding of what is going on. The notion that people in the salons of New York, Berkeley, California, should shrink from to give the kind of freedom, a hope for freedom, towards which 1 million refugees fled from North Vietnam, strikes me as a high indication of that kind of
that 1 million refugees, I've heard explained two ways. One of Northerners who wanted to infiltrate the South. I was very impressed by that fight, and that's why I joined, which I had to leave, a committee of friends of Vietnam, when I saw how badly things were going. But all this about how we're helping freedom is not justified by anything that's happened in South Vietnam, not by the present demonstrations. I'm not arguing too definitely from them, except they show no love for the key government and they show comparatively little love for the United States. And you talk of freedom. We are sending under conscription into an undeclared war halfway around the world, our sons to fight when we aren't even sure that they want us there, judged by the recent demonstrations.
Well,
this is not primary to my argument, but it has to do with it.
The demonstrations, as you know, Ms. Thomas, can merely be a matter of factionalism. But perhaps we can agree on this, that even though it was true that in Vichy France, the overwhelming majority of the population was in accord with a situation of perpetual servitude to the Nazis, this didn't deter us from our resolution to liberate France.
It is quite true that
you get tired of any comparisons that inconvenience you, Mr. Thomas, because you can't stand to think about this subject, because it's a very unsettling experience.
I have thought a great deal about it and found
the wrong conclusion.
No solution between Ho and Hitler. There is not an equivalence.
It seems to me also
between the Civil War in Vietnam and what happened in Europe with the Germans with Hitler, there is not an equivalence. This is the evil of the assumption that you make. And in the terms of what you can win, there is not an equivalence, because you're not going to win by getting a desolate country, which we have to support halfway around the globe, in the face of the critical opinion of much of the world, against an enemy which can come so strong as China.
Yeah.
You've got to learn to coexist with China or die.
We've covered that territory, and I
No, we
maintain
haven't.
you
merely made certain assertions.
all right, we disagree. I've maintained that we did prove precisely that point in South Korea. But let me give you for a moment something.
We still have to keep.
Let me probe for a moment the consequences of not winning. The consequences of not winning are that you will have to start another committee to keep us from saving Thailand the next day.
Wait.
And another one the year after that to keep us from saving Japan or the Philippines or Australia.
What I'm proposing is what ought to be tried. The president.
I just want to note that that's nice because, point to Buckley there, because we all remember, of course, from our history classes how after the United States lost the war in Vietnam, there were then wars in Thailand and Japan because the dominoes were falling.
Yeah, no, nice statement. Nice clear statement of the domino theory there. I know everything Buckley says turns out to be discredited. Do you feel like there's I feel like Buckley's being rather cruel with the fact that Thomas, as an 82-year-old man, takes pauses and he's like jumping at the old man's pauses to try and like shout at him and throw him off and confuse him if he can.
Yeah, he is. I think he is, but I think it also makes it that much more impressive that that Thomas seems totally unfazed by it.
Yeah. Jesus Christ, what an asshole Buckley is. He's just such a prick.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
Who has considerable talent at this ought to seek a ceasefire. Rather
What
dramatically.
do you think he's been seeking?
He has.
For 39 days, he suspended the bombing.
A senator of the United States put it pretty well. He said that the senator, he said it privately, so I can't give you his name. And he isn't anybody you'd suspect. He votes right. I'll agree with this.
So my point is,
my point is to tell you about the senator. Then you tell me your point. My point is concerns what you said. He said Johnson has 4 or 5 different speeches. One for the Hawks, one for the Doves, one for Ho Chi Minh, one for the South Vietnamese. And the mix-up, it's very hard to tell what he means. And he has not sought ceasefire on the basis which alone you'd be likely to get it.
Are these
full recognition of our principal opponent?
I want to hear about these secret speeches. These are speeches that you and
I
are
open spaces, and I'm quoting a senator.
Well,
a senator.
I don't need a senator to tell me how to interpret the open speeches. I can hear them by myself.
I'm telling that there are other people.
And I say there's a thread of
I know that you are. I know that you are the master of a long series of talks here, but you are not the only person in the United States who interprets things. And here is a senator, which you aren't yet.
For once in my life, I'm along with 85%.
Here is a senator who said what I said and what I think is a pretty shrewd observation in the way it must appear in Vietnam.
Maybe the senator isn't very bright.
Well, you're goading me to tell you who he is, and you.
I believe that. By the way, amazing. It was not intentional, but I like where we're paused.
That is a fantastic and classic Buckley face.
Exactly. But when he says, perhaps the senator is not very bright, I think that's his cute way of saying, are you talking about Fulbright? I mean, that's just a guess, but.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
I felt this digression. I don't know why Thomas has wandered down this route, but let's see where it goes.
I'm surprised if I did, and since he said it in a private talk, I won't tell you.
No, but Mr. Thomas, let me just say that I think that President Johnson, although I disagree with him on many things,
on the more important
has
things
shown
right.
a thread of consistency. Has shown a thread of consistency, and I do think, if I may say so, sir, that considering the obeisances that you have paid throughout your life to democracy, you ought perhaps to shrink a little bit from using such adjectives as cruel and animalistic and stupid, as regards a policy which is subscribed to by the overwhelming members not only of the people but of the intelligentsia.
I have never thought
These aren't stupid people. Max Taylor isn't stupid, for instance. Neither is Dean Russ.
stupid.
Is everybody stupid who disagrees with you? Or give me
No,
one.
by no means.
Give me one exception.
Well, I don't even consider you stupid. I just
Just cruel.
I just think you try to too hard to be witty rather than to get down to the heart of a subject.
It's terribly hard not to be witty when discussing your
stupid. The
unfortunate
point
position.
I'm making is this: that bright people do stupid things. Some of the brightest people I know in politics.
And you
were
uniquely know when that
Wait
happens,
a minute.
don't you?
Yes.
You ought to write a book on epistemology.
Not by my any abnormal trait, but by the laws of logic and common sense. For instance,
Sir,
some very strongly minded people were awfully wrong about the idea that you could deal with China as a communist country by non-recognition and by claiming that Chiang, ingloriously driven out, is entitled to the seat in the UN.
Sir, we will
That's
be back
one
with you in just
stupid
one
thing
moment.
for logical reasons,
Just one
even
moment,
if
sir.
not some non-stupid people did it.
You were saying.
Well, just more of the same from Buckley. I mean, this is the one problem with watching Firing Line is that, like, so someone in the comments said this could really use a moderator. I mean, Buckley is not a serious debater. I mean, this is the theater of debate. But not, you know, he isn't substantive. He tries to throw people off, distract them. He tries to prevent a real discussion. He did this with Chomsky too, where it ended up being a very unsatisfactory discussion on Vietnam. Like, you think, oh, I want to watch Chomsky and Buckley discuss the war in Vietnam, but because Buckley's just throwing in, you know, little irrelevant, witty comments that he hopes will deter the person from pursuing their point. A lot of these Firing Lines discussions end up being really, really frustrating.
Yeah, fair. I mean, I do think Thomas is like making a mistake when he starts, you know, trying to talk about this comment that the senator has made, because it's like, it kind of sounds like the sort of thing that, like, if it was just Norman Thomas chatting with his friends, and he could be like, well, the senator told me this thing, and like, isn't that interesting? Isn't that insightful? You know, then like it might be like a perfectly reasonable way to like introduce a point. But like, I think when you're arguing with somebody, you know, it's probably a bad idea, right? Because it's like, well,
Yeah.
okay, there's some vague comment from this anonymous senator. Like, what's the point?
Yeah.
Right?
So
like,
what?
so it's
What if I reject the authority of this senator? Then what?
Yeah, exactly. So that was a mistake. He shouldn't have done that. I still do kind of admire the way that Thomas is totally unfazed by Buckley's bullshit here, and he just like doggedly pursues that until he's made his point, right? You know, it's like, and I also like the and I also like his recitation of like all the painfully obvious differences between, you know, Vietnam and World War II, right? You know, that and this, I mean, it's kind of depressing in a way that in 1966, you know, that this was already a thing, right? Because it's like, this is something you see all the time now, right? You know, that like every single war that ever happens, right, everybody has to find some way of interpreting as being World War II, because that's like the only sort of like moral framework for thinking about wars that anybody can understand.
Yeah.
You know, so like
everything is Munich too. Everything is all diplomacy is appeasement.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it's like if you have, well, I mean, you know, Vladimir Putin, right? You know, was trying to rig some of that, you know, World War II juice, you know, for his war effort, you know, with the
he's fighting Nazis and we're fighting Nazis. Everyone's fighting Nazis.
Yeah. The Putinist version of reality is that, you know, they're the purpose of the, you know, one of the purposes of the invasion was to denazify Ukraine, and then you get these bizarre arguments about whether there are more Nazis in Russia or Ukraine, because like that's definitely how you should decide what you think about these things. You need to count the Nazis, but then if you've got a Ukrainian flag in your bio on Twitter, then it's also World War II, but in this version of World War II, Putin is Hitler, and any sort of peace negotiations are Munich, and the correct response is the one that Norman Thomas is giving here, which is just like, why the fuck are we talking about World War II? This is obviously a completely disanalogous situation.
That's right.
I think Mr. Thomas said it was stupid to refrain from recognizing Red China. Is that correct?
That's very right.
And
Thanks,
you say
Ron.
that we now have the proof of it?
Yes.
Or what is the proof of it? What
proof
makes you
of-
think that
the
they
proof
would have
of
been
it.
more civilized if we had accepted them? Have they been more civilized
There-
in England who did accept them?
Yes, somewhat.
Ah.
They've allowed more people to go and see something. The point I'm making is this, that we have made progress with Russia, partly because Russia was included in the family of nations. We might have made some progress. We would at least have had a moral position and a practical position in the world if we had not put ourselves in the silly position of saying that Chong ingloriously driven out of China. And I've sat in Hong Kong and heard refugees tell me about his bad stories about his.
Oh, come on
government,
now.
about
Let's
the
not
others.
get into Chiang Kai-shek. Let me just ask
Well,
you the
that's
question.
the whole reason for this whole Vietnam business.
Thank you for the super chat, Rod. I just want to pause to appreciate the line, "Oh, come on, let's not get into Chiang Kai-shek." That it's like, yeah, all in favor of liberty and the preservation of democracy when it's convenient to your argument, but
That's
Norman
ancient history.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, Chiang Kai-shek,
Don't tell you
whatever.
that.
Yeah, exactly. Norman Thomas keeps trying to bring up the authoritarianism of the Diem regime in Vietnam. Buckley obviously won't touch that. Chiang Kai-shek, that was a long time ago, so who cares about that? Greece, Buckley actually wants to bring up, but apparently he has no problem, with the authoritarianism of the generals, he's apologizing for, and in Greece, right? So it's like that. Democracy is like very important, except when it isn't. All right.
Are concerned with
If
the
you can
stuff in
just
China.
hold your demonology for one moment, let's pursue the single point of whether or
It's
not
you
it
who
would
are
have helped us,
demonologist,
whether it
with
would have helped us to
communism is the
recognize
devil.
Red China. Now, you said, after all, Red China has invited more Englishmen to come in. Would it have been an act of civility by Adolf Hitler to have invited more people to visit Buchenwald? I don't see really that the English have proved a blessed thing. And there's no reason at all to suppose that Russia has in any way become blander as a result of their exposure to yourself or to myself. Most recently, they have cracked down again. They became a little bit blander when Stalin died, which was 25 years after we recognized the Soviet Union.
But the process, in the meanwhile, we've been allied with Russia and against a worse man who was Hitler, and various things happened. Therefore, one doesn't press this too far. But you either live to learn to live somehow with people under these circumstances, or with nations, or ultimately you fight them. We haven't half tried. We have given the Chinese a considerable excuse for their extreme.
I think we've tried much too hard. I think we should have done everything we could to overthrow China.
In other words, you would have fought China.
In other words, yes. In other words, I want to be incinerated in the blast of atomic dust.
Well,
Is that what you were going to say?
No, I wasn't. But how would you have overthrown China without using an incinerating blast?
Well, in 1962, it seems to me, was precisely the moment when, during the period of starvation and misery in Red China, Chiang Kai-shek should have been permitted to establish a beachhead in China and encouraged a revolt. You see, the sheer hopelessness. The funny thing about you is you're considered an idealist, but you're only an idealist as regards the peace of the people you happen to love. You seem to have no idealism at all about people who suffer under the kind of tyranny which you would abhor for yourself and your children. We're not supposed to do anything about them, are we?
You're not supposed to do what you wanted. We would have. I believe it's Good Friday, and while we were recording.
And what do you do?
I would think that you could occasionally overcome evil with good.
What Red Chinese gets down on his knees and thanks you for your exertions?
Well, let me just tell you what I listen to.
If you can come up with one, I'll put him in the Smithsonian. What have you done? What have you done for the communists in Red China that gives them any hope?
What have I done to the
Yes.
communists of Red China? I have favored feeding people when they're hungry, even if they were communists. I have favored an attempt, at least, to negotiate even with my enemies in order to settle a thing without this incineration, which, whatever your purpose
I'm
would
talking
be, the
about what have you
necessary
done to
word.
liberate them? What have you done to give them a
I am here
prospect?
to tell you that
for
neither you nor I could liberate them, unfortunately.
I could.
Perhaps. Could you?
Oh, certainly.
No, you couldn't.
Certainly.
This
I
is just-
representing a school of thought. I don't think there's any reason
look, there
why Red China is undeliverable in the sense that, for instance, Nazi Germany
well,
was.
I have read considerable, and I have never seen any book of any repute which argues that the communist regime in China is now either so unloved, so hated, or so weak that it can be overthrown. Least of all by Chiang. I sat through a conference with the communist refugees in Hong Kong, who told me about as bad stories about Chiang's government as they ever told me about Mao's.
I read dozens of books
And
about
wait a minute.
Hitler saying
And
exactly the same thing.
what they said was that Chiang could never come back, that he'd be a useful auxiliary to our armies. And what they said would be done would be this, that we ought to fight. This was back in 52, not 62, when communism was less well established. They said we ought to fight, make it our war. It would be something of a guerrilla war and very difficult, but we could win by judicious use of bombs. Now, I see no reason, not the slightest reason, to think there was a different situation in 62.
Well, as a matter of fact, Mr. Thomas,
you'd have started a war that would have burned up the world.
As a matter of fact, Mr. Thomas, the Chinese communist system was much weaker in 62 than 52. And I doubt that there's a reputable historian in the United States who would disagree with that contention. During 52, there was still some sort of a vestige of romantic expectations. In 62, they had 10 years of misery as a result of precisely the kind of bad statesmanship, which unfortunately you didn't object to.
You're probably going to tell me that he's no authority, but did you ever read Edgar Snow? Did you ever read Jan Myrdal? Do you think that the village that he described, I know this is only a typical and not a whole story, do you think that the village he decided is ready to overthrow the communist government, or even wants to?
No, Mr. Thomas, here's what I think, which is perhaps a little bit more discomforting and something that will displease you most. I think that human beings can be made to live like animals. A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which has just been re-outlawed in the Soviet Union, shows how even in concentration camps, under conditions which you and I would rather commit suicide than submit to, people can somehow live. Their biological mechanisms continue to work. And I have no doubt that this is going on in Red China. I have no doubt that it went on in Nazi Germany. All I'm observing is that by standards that we consider civilized, these are wretched people, and that we have some sort of a sacred mission to hold out hope for them.
I do not think
and that we can't do that by shaky knees every time we throw a napalm bomb on a sniper in North Vietnam.
We don't throw them on snipers. We have to throw them on villages. We use our sons under conscription, under your theory, in order to bring what doesn't exist in South Vietnam to Vietnam.
How can it exist?
We
former
live in a world where we cannot possibly play universal policeman, where we can set a great many ideals in motion, when we can give much better economic aid, when we can do a great many things we haven't done.
I think Johnson.
And again, wait just a minute. And again, I want to tell you that I wish you would read carefully this report by Myrdal on his Chinese village where he lived with his wife for a while. These are not the records of people who are totally miserable. China was miserable anyway, and I imagine that the people who stayed in China, now that the general order is restored, are better off than they were in the last 100 years. The refugees suffered, the dead suffered, and look, in Indonesia, 300,000, according to some estimates, alleged communists have been killed. There's cruelty of the vastest sort, which I loathe and hate. What I desire is a situation in which you can substitute negotiation, on the basis of getting rid of this kind of terror, of a neutralization of Southeast Asia.
May I make two observations? One is that I'm for negotiation too. Everybody's for negotiation except the communists who refuse to do so. And number two, as a former president of the Americans of for democratic action, no less, wrote recently in the New York Times, the notion is not only romantic, but it's vulgar to suppose that something can be done to build up the economy and the state of civil liberties in South Vietnam during a period when they are engaged in a war for survival. He gives it one figure, which I think you ought to contemplate, and that is that 30,000 people carefully trained in civics, carefully trained to be mayors and aldermen in their little communities, carefully trained to be agronomists, have been killed, butchered by the Viet Cong. Now, this is an indispensable cadre that takes time to replenish. And for you to suppose that you need only to touch South Vietnam with one of Mr. Myrdal's books and all of a sudden have freedom sprout out like daisies on the fields is simply another and consistent index of your own adult.
I was talking about Myrdal in reference to the state of affairs in China, not at all in South Vietnam.
But he has ideas in South Vietnam. He has ideas on everything.
There's no connection there, and it's not. I don't even think it's very smart debating.
No, but the utopians who suppose.
What I am saying, I am not that kind of utopian, and I am saying
it's highly irrelevant for you to talk about the state of freedom or lack of freedom in South Vietnam in the middle of a war as brutal as this one. Do you realize they didn't even have elections in England, the mother of parliaments, during their war?
I am saying this, that the only way you'll have a chance of freedom is to.
Oh yeah, don't we remember when when like the military seized power in England in the middle of World War II and abolished parliamentary democracy?
So he's finally gotten around to acknowledging that we are supporting an authoritarian regime in South Vietnam in the name of freedom, but pointed out that, well, it's a war, so how could you possibly expect democracy and freedom? That'll come later, once we've won the war, to defend this authoritarian regime. Also very interesting that Buckley has to take his principles so far as to say, well, we should have invaded China and and we should have liberated them with nuclear weapons if necessary for freedom.
For freedom, yeah. It's just right. I mean, that was actually a extra helping of insanity I was not expecting in this debate, that he was saying that, oh no, we totally should have started an all-out war with China 4 years ago, which would certainly have still been going on at the time they were talking. But no, that is like astonishingly insane. Like, how does William F. Buckley think that Chinese communism came about in the first place? Right? Like, does he think there was some invading army from somewhere that imposed that on China? Like that, this is, that like there were like Russian troops maybe, who were like, I mean, this is a peasant revolution, right? I mean, obviously there was still a massive base popular support even without, an invading army, that like. And not to mention, by the way, that like they were talking about the Korean War earlier, right? I mean, like America had already fought Chinese troops in Korea, and it did not go particularly well for us. Right? That there was that was what drove the U.S. back from North Korea. In the late stage of the war was China getting involved. I mean, the idea that there's some land invasion of China that was...
No, we could seize the whole country. That is what he is advocating.
And, what's the difference between that and Nazi Germany? It's like, well, I mean, just to start with, Nazi Germany was, in an active state of war with most of the rest of the world, right? That like, so that... and yeah, no, that was absolutely... that was absolutely amazing. And also, I do just want to note that like his whole defense of DM here, which again is also like, okay, yes, there don't happen to have been any parliamentary elections in England during the war, right? But like, I would be very surprised. Like, I guess I wouldn't claim to be any kind of expert on, England in the 1940s, but I think the idea that like state of democracy in Great Britain in the early 1940s was like anything like equivalent to like the DM dictatorship in Vietnam is like a really, really weird thing to say.
Mhm.
Like, no, I mean, there were clearly, I mean, parliament existed, right, with multiple political parties and, you know, all of that stuff. But so that seems like weird history. I also missed earlier, I did, he seemed to be making this bizarre statement that like most French people were all for being occupied by the Nazis. And I have no idea what he's basing that on.
Oh yes, he did say that, didn't he? but we liberated them, even though they wanted. So that's our case study showing that sometimes you got to liberate people who don't want to be liberated,
Exactly.
like killing them all. In the case of Vietnam.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I mean, it's funny how close it is to that infamous quote from Vietnam where we destroyed the village in order to save it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Also, just want to note that his whole defense of the DM regime here is that, well, you can't have freedom and, you know, yeah, sure, it's a war for freedom and democracy, but you can't have freedom and democracy while there's a war going on, which, you know, is also like a kind of a goofy thing to say, right? I mean, there were, you know, the United States certainly did have an election during World War II, and there was also, you know, the U.S. also had a real election during the Civil War. But like, regardless, that defense sounds like nothing so much as like a Stalinist explaining that, like, well, sure, it's very unfortunate, right? You know, that we can't have like flourishing socialist democracy, but you know, after all, we're being encircled and besieged by the capitalist powers.
No, I just only just noticed from what you said that the reason he picked Britain was because the United States, he couldn't pick the United States because we did have an election during an ongoing war, right? So we had the 1944 election took place in the U.S., so he had to pick Britain. Because the United States would have actually proven that actually you can have elections during a war.
Yeah. And you know, don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are all kinds of civil liberties, you know, crackdowns on you know, in the UK during the war, which, you know, is like whatever. I mean, this is one of the reasons that wars are very bad and should be avoided if at all possible. They tend to be really bad for civil liberties, but again, like, these things come in degrees, and the idea that there was like no, you know, that like it was functionally equivalent living under Churchill or DM is you know, pretty goofy. But anyway, let's keep going.
To get peace, that it's war that's the great enemy.
I'm for peace
I'm
too.
saying that McGovern,
but you're not going to have
McGovern says
peace
that he
with a
went to
prospect.
hospitals in South Vietnam and saw more people who were there, civilians, who were victims of our policy of bombing, than he did of the Viet Cong terror, which I dislike very much. I am not for surrendering to Viet Cong. I am for making a kind of effort that hasn't been made for a negotiation which involves recognizing them as the principal negotiators.
You're for sending one over one of your committees to teach them.
Reconvening the Geneva nations.
But they won't even attend, Mr. Thomas. They have said they won't attend.
There has been
unless
no
we agree to recognize them as the single government of South Vietnam.
There has been no presentation of a proper program, which, if they refused, might change the situation.
We'll be back, sir, in just a minute after this message.
Gentlemen, we will now have questions directed to you from members of our audience. I would like to suggest to those who are asking the questions that you simply rise when I call your name, direct your question to either Mr. Buckley or Mr. Thomas. And gentlemen, if after either one of you has commented on the question, the other decides he has something he would like to add, or as the case might be, detract, please feel free to do so. Our first question, I believe, is for Mr. Thomas, and it is from James Batch. Mr. Batch, please.
Mr. Thomas, I'd like to know how much territory you think we should let the communists have before we try to stop them.
I don't think it's
How many million square miles?
I don't think it's a very good question, if you forgive me for saying so, because the question isn't how much territory will you allow them to have, but what general way is the best way to stop the spread of communism. And I am saying that to carry on this war against little Vietnam, devastating it, without trying as hard as we ought to try to get a negotiated peace, plays in the long run into the hands of communism and makes quite likely a world war. I was opposed to some of the territory we did let the communists have at the end of the Second World War, but I don't believe that the remedy is more war and more war.
Mr. Buckley, do you have a comment, sir?
No, sir, I don't.
All right. In that case, Mr. Buckley, the next question is directed to you. It comes from Mr. Raymond Klein.
May I preface and say that I've known Mr. Thomas for more than 35 years. I'm very happy to note that he still can provoke a very spirited discussion. But my question is directed at you, Mr. Buckley. Stuart Alsop, in opposition for escalating the war, quotes Walter Lippmann. As each succeeding prediction and promise of the president's advisors turned out to be wrong, the only remedy they have been able to offer the president is that he should send in more troops and do more bombing. Also, James Reston, quote, error starts in the mind. Wrong assumptions lead to wrong decisions. And this has been the tragedy of Vietnam from the beginning. I'd like to have your comments on those quotes, sir.
Well, I think Mr. Stewart also ought to be introduced to Mr. Joseph Alsop, who I think has said very cogently why it has been in the past necessary to escalate and why certain kinds of escalations may now be in order. I don't think that the assumptions are incorrect any more than, and I don't think that Mr. Lippmann's assumptions are necessarily correct any more than they were in the 30s when he was telling us that we oughtn't to do anything to attempt to stop the aggressions of Japan on the grounds that that was Japan's natural sphere of interest. I think, in a word, that escalations are in order, provided there is a net advantage that inures to us. And since we have the military potential and the determination and the wealth that make it possible for us to stop communism from overwhelming all of Southeast Asia, we need only to make it clear to the enemy that we will visit insupportable damage on them if they attempt to proceed in their holy crusade for the conquest of the world.
Mr. Thomas, do you feel that that answer requires any further comment?
Only to say just this, that of course I think that the course we're pursuing in the long run is to the net advantage of communism. Our action far from home, our refusal to try harder to get out of the situation by negotiation, I think plays into communist hands. I think that as for the rest, I'm quite willing to accept what has been said.
Our next question, sir, is for you, Mr. Buckley, from Louis Messina.
Buckley, with what facts do you base your belief that communism is responsible for the Vietnam War?
Well, it's like asking me, how do I know that Julius Caesar was stabbed in 44 BC? I don't know where I first saw it or read it, but I suppose the easiest place to get, I think, a satisfactory documentation of it is by asking the State Department for its white paper on the subject.
Mr. Thomas, I'm assuming you have something
that
to
white
say.
paper, you mean? Did
Well,
you ever read
I
I.F.
don't know
Stone's
what-
expose of that famous white paper?
Yeah, I've read a lot by I.F. Stone, including the fact that we were responsible for germ warfare in Korea and that Stalin was absolutely innocent in the purge trials and so on. I don't.
I
I.F.
asked you
Stone
if you
from
read
knowledge.
this particular thing, which meticulously gave facts which were very different from those supported by a State Department.
And I'm saying his facts were unreliable, Mr. Thomas. Didn't you
Most
get it?
of them
Didn't you get the
taken from
message?
official reports.
I don't trust him. That's my message.
And
I
I
don't know
don't
whether
trust in our government, which was consistently wrong until very lately. Even McNamara, who was a very able man, came back over and over telling how we were in the verge of victory and all the boys be back at the end of 65. If it comes to trust, the last I don't trust
The last you don't
The
trust us
government.
on?
the government. I trust some features.
I don't think Mr. Messina realized he was triggering still another debate on the program, Mr. Buckley. Our next question comes from Mr. Michael DiStefano. I believe it's directed to you, Mr. Thomas.
Yes, Mr. Thomas, in view of the fact that the Vietnamese way of life has been perpetuated by certain basic tenets, such as the theory of personal property and emphasis on the family relationship, these conform to Occidental rather than communistic tendencies. Now, I'd like to know, do you believe there's any sound basis for the belief that the South Vietnamese people would vote pro-communist in a free election in view of these facts?
I don't know how they'd vote. I want them to have a chance. I would say that if they ultimately got around to a place where they voted for communism, which was under conditions of neutralization, when they had a communism somewhat like Yugoslavia, which might be possible because of the dissensions between Russia and China, that it would be very much not what my heart would desire, but it would be much better than a long continuance of war for them, for us, and for the world.
Mr. Buckley, am I correct in thinking you have something to say?
Yes. I don't think anybody has the right to vote for communism. Because when you vote for communism, you don't vote for something as it regards yourself. You vote for something as it regards other people, too. I don't think the people in the United States have the right to vote to prevent me, let's say, from going to church, or the right to keep me from speaking freely. And by the same token in which I cherish my own rights, I think other people have rights, too, even if they're merely South Vietnamese.
Mr. Buckley, the next question.
Well, there you have it. I don't think people have a right to vote for communists.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that is the core of it, right? I mean, it's like this is a war for democracy where you kind of know that given a democratic decision, it wouldn't go your way.
Yeah, so no elections because they vote for the wrong people. I mean, this is always it's funny just to hear coming out of his mouth something so close to the left critique of U.S. meddling in other countries' elections, which is you can vote the way you like as long as it's not for the people we don't want in power. And he's going, yeah, no, of course they don't have a right to vote for the people I don't want in power.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is the Henry Kissinger line when Salvador Allende was elected. I don't see why Chile should be allowed to go communist simply because its voters are irresponsible.
There you go. Okay.
The next question is for you, sir. It comes from Richard Toth.
The Ripon Society has advocated that the Republican Party fill a vacuum of leadership as far as containing China militarily, but yet increasing context. What is your opinion on this?
Well, my opinion is that the Ripon Society really advocates that the Republican Party ought to join the Americans for Democratic Action. I really don't see why they don't address their recommendations to the Democratic Party, even though that would be an exercise in redundancy. I don't think the Republican Party would have any interest at all to follow the program of the Ripon Society, which is purely imitative in character.
Mr. Thomas, is there anything that you'd care to answer? You're passing. All right, sir. I think we have
not necessarily for agreement, but just what's the use?
We have a question directed to you, sir. It's from Francis X. Clark.
Mr. Thomas, would you please state the basis or bases, if any, for your contention that the communists would abide by any treaty in South Vietnam, since history has shown us that they will not?
I'm awfully sorry. I'm tottering. I couldn't hear that. Will somebody
May I repeat it for you, sir? Mr. Clark's question is, he would like you to state the basis or bases, if any, for your contention that the communists would abide by any treaty in South Vietnam, since it is his contention that history has shown us that the communists will not do so.
I think they very likely would if they thought it was to their interest, their enlightened self-interest, which is an interest, after all, in peace. They made a peace finally after 8 years' struggle with Austria and for Austria. They didn't break it even when Austria gave asylum to Hungarian refugees. They made a treaty for the neutralization from military use of Antarctica. They have observed it because it's their interest. They have so far observed fairly well their treaties with Finland, which they could, of course, crush. I am not here to protest the love of communists of keeping treaties. I'm here to say that the basis of observing treaties is that, after all, they do promote certain mutual interest, and in a world that becomes progressively sane, that interest is against war.
Mr. Buckley, I detect some note of disagreement on your part.
Well, it's just the old point once again that we're precisely trying to make it in the interest of the North Vietnamese to abide by a treaty. If we don't do precisely what we're doing now, and perhaps even more of it, there is going to be no pressure whatever on the North Vietnamese communists to abide by the treaty. After all, there was not a perfectly good treaty because it was unenforceable, but there is an extant treaty, which, if they were disposed to abide by treaties, they could perfectly well begin to do tomorrow. So it is those people like Lyndon Johnson who are precisely engaged in reminding not only us but the world at large that that it is precisely force, or the threat of force, that keeps the communists interested potentially in treaties.
Only
Buckley,
one observation, and that observation is that we also broke the treaty which we didn't sign. If you mean the Geneva
You can't
Agreement.
break a treaty you don't sign.
Well, you broke it for the rest of the world. The effect
we
is the
didn't.
same.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we have come to the point where we conclude our question and answers. We will be back in a moment after this message.
Mr. Thomas, it's good to see you again. Every time I'm with you, you make me feel young. You get my blood running, and I certainly appreciate it. I think you've endeavored to make 2 points today. One is that you have no charm, and one is that we should get out of Vietnam. I don't think you've been successful in either. So nice to see you, and I hope to see you again soon.
That was Buckley being douchey, right? The you make me feel young.
Such a douche.
like he's clearly talking to this like 200-year-old man who has who has to pause a lot, who can't hear one of the questions, and he's like, "Oh, you make me feel young."
Oh God, he's so obnoxious. I'm just reminded of how it's so funny because he's got this reputation as being kind of debonair, and you would think he would have good manners, but he has horrible manners. Like, he's just incredibly rude and nasty, and he interrupts people. And of course, he famously called Gore Vidal queer, threatened to punch him in the face, right? There's something really, really unpleasant about this man who cultivated this reputation as being a real refined intellectual.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, how much of it, how much of that is just whatever that accent is, which, by the way, there's quite a bit of speculation about in the chat. Our friend Strom McCollum suggested that maybe it's some sort of weird hybrid that he ended up having of Yankee, Yankee Brahmin kind of accent to the deep Southern one. That's as plausible an explanation as I've heard of how he ended up talking like that. But yeah, I think something about the accent, something about the fact that he has a, famously he went to Yale, and he makes that kind of background very obvious, right? But it's but yeah, I think there's this sort of weird slippage where it's well, he has, he talks weird, he's got an elite education, therefore, he's this he's this charming gentleman, right? Rather than it's no, he's just an asshole, right? But he's a rich guy, asshole, and
he's a rich prick.
He's definitely
he's an arrogant rich prick,
and he's definitely and he's definitely smarter than a lot of people who resemble in a lot of those other ways. But it's no, he's still a horrible asshole. But I also kind of think yes, Thompson says God and CIA at Yale. Yeah, I think it's also, I will say, right, despite all that, right, that he was he was being extremely aggressive towards somebody who just has some built-in disadvantages because he's an extremely old man. like, I've got to say, I mean, obviously I'm hugely biased here, both out of in terms of political values and also because I have the advantage of knowing what happened, right? That
because of all of the history after this, yeah.
Yeah, that the U.S. losing the war in Vietnam, and by the way, also recognizing China, was fine, right? Nothing
Yeah.
horrible happened as a result of either one of those. But a enormous amount of death and suffering was caused by the U.S. state in Vietnam as long as it did. But okay, so obviously I am biased in all these ways, but it's still so maybe I'm deluding myself here, but I just have to think anybody who's at all sort of on the fence or persuadable is watching this, has got to pick up at some point that Norman Thomas is Norman Thomas is like a little bit like a 1966 Bernie Sanders here, right? He wants to, he's all business, right? He wants straight to the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is all cute. Let's talk about Vietnam. Let's talk about the history of Vietnam. Let's talk about, I want to hear how this escalation strategy is going to work. That he has this pretty straightforward case that he wants to make, and Buckley is kind of all over the place in response to it. He says all kinds of things that are off topic. He's being very witty, but in a way that's the way that's super evasive. A lot of this, I just none of this. I hope, right? Anybody who watched this at the time, I none of this makes it seem like Buckley has this strong counter argument.
Well, did you hear what Buckley's plan for how he was going to bring freedom to South Vietnam was? No, he didn't ever give it. And he said, well, save Vietnam and then it's on to China. So if we just...
which is also, by the way, this is that Liz Brudig line I always like to quote. By the way, I see that Liz is off of Twitter, which the best comment I saw about that was somebody who said they were sorry to hear that insofar as they liked Liz's tweets, but happy to hear that insofar as they liked her. That because being on Twitter is horrible, but that Liz Brudig line that I always like to quote about how half the point of a debate is to get the other person to tell you what they really think, right? That's well, Buckley certainly did here.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He wants to invade China.
Invade China, and you can't vote for communists. Yeah, no, pretty clear. And in a war you don't get any democracy at all. If we just to finish here on, we did, you and I, the last one we did was Bernie Sanders versus Lindsey Graham, and of course, if we are talking about the lessons that one can get, because I presume that the reason some people watch these beyond the entertainment value of watching 1960s intellectuals go at it is that you can learn a lot about good and bad ways of countering certain arguments, how to be effective in advancing a left position. And I think that in many, Norman Thomas, I don't like the way he used kind of the anti-communist premises a lot. I'm the better anti-communist than you. I'm not so fond of that. He went down a few side tangents that he didn't need to go down, but for the most part, what he did was he stuck to really, really important points, trying to get out the history of why we were in Vietnam, trying to get out the fact that there is no viable path to anything that any of Buckley's dreams for South Vietnam, just trying to really, really stick to the issues. And I think if we had, one lesson from this and from Norman Thomas's performance here, it's that even if you're old and slow, if you're just a steamroller and you just keep on the point, don't go off the track, just keep on it, you can be really effective even against someone who's really, really quick and smart and who is sort of darting around you, try to punch you here and there. You can still do pretty well. Ben, you're on mute.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is. I mean, I actually, man, we might still. Do we actually? We might. No. Okay. Um, but I do. In fact, the last thing I wrote for Current Affairs
Right.
was about this to a great extent, right? It was about Crystal and Bill Maher, and one of the things I said in there that like is absolutely crucial is have a that you're sort of putting forward a single clear narrative and and kind of and adding to it over the course of the debate, right? That like in the case of that Bernie Sanders, Lindsey Graham debate that we watched, right? The sort of single clear narrative is about how bad economic inequality and everything that follows from it is, right? And how Lindsey Graham, remember, Lindsey Graham, he was attacking not as a representative of the Republican Party, not as representative of, I don't know, conservative, values or anything like that, right? But as a representative of the establishment, right? Which he made very clear, was a, encompassing term. And somebody who was, on the side of the billionaires, that they, and in this case, right, Thomas Buckley. I mean, I think Norman Thomas, is, single clear point, right? Was that that this is that this is an unjustifiable and unwinnable war. That the pretense to be in a war for democracy was nonsense, and there was no scenario by which the United States could win, other than essentially destroying the country. And and Buckley never really, like, he was throwing so much at the wall in response to that, right? That I think he never look, I mean, what did Buckley do? He proved his point, right? That it's like he defended the undemocraticness of South Vietnam, and I mean, let's say like if you're concerned, if you're watching this, you've got to think, right? You're concerned that like, oh my God, right? What could happen if we keep escalating in Vietnam, right? I mean, could you get like a much worse war or whatever? Like, look, I mean, Buckley's not your guy to talk you down from that. I mean, he wants to invade China.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the line where Buckley said, and if you're afraid of dropping some napalm on a few snipers, and Thomas said, we drop it on villages.
Yes, you get shaky in the knees every time we
shaky in the knees.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Like that, it's like, oh man, you get all, weak-kneed and girlish at the every time we wipe out a village full of random Vietnamese peasants, and burn them alive with napalm.
Yeah, squeamish.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Thomas, is very quick on his feet and very on point there, right? That it's like, that like, oh really, you're just the napalm, is just being targeted at snipers, right? That
you can launch an airstrike on a sniper, giant B-52s,
right? That you're dumping, chemicals that burn people's skin off. That like that's like that well targeted, right? I mean, it's bad enough in 2022 when people try to claim it about like drones, but like 1966, just dumping chemicals out that they have that's so targeted that it's only finding the sniper.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
that was fun. That was a good one.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you suggested that. This is fantastic. Haven't gotta it's a little bit like sort of making sure we, meet the food groups on this. We haven't done a Buckley one in a little while, so
Oldie but a goodie.
yeah, exactly. So what have you got coming up?
Jesus! You know what you interrupted me from? Well, I tell you, I'm
What's
working
that?
on the foreign policy book, but I'm currently reviewing the memoir of Lauren Boebert. The congresswoman, the far right MAGA congresswoman from Colorado. She wrote a memoir. There's a really interesting thing in her memoir. And the interesting thing, now she's a totally unsympathetic person. She's just ridiculous. The last thing she said was Venezuelans eat dogs because they don't have the right to bear arms.
Yes.
So it's just ridiculous stuff. She's real racist towards Ilhan Omar, called her terrorist and all that stuff. Horrible person. But there's an interesting thing in her memoir where she writes about the financial crisis. Now she's actually working class, right? She doesn't have a college degree, which is very rare in Congress. She dropped out of high school. Financial crisis. She and her husband had just bought their house, and they got behind on their mortgage, and they tried to get a modification, and they couldn't under the terrible Obama administration home mortgage assistance program. The servicer just strung them along and then foreclosed on them, and they lost their house. And she says that proved to her that progressives are a fraud, and the government won't help you, and you're just on your own. And what's interesting is sometimes she's called the right-wing AOC, because she's in her early 30s, and she's a millennial. She went through the same stuff as a lot of things that turned a lot of millennials into socialists, but it turned her further into a sort of hard right conservative. But it's a really interesting thing because her district is not a hard right district. And the point that I make in the article is not that Lauren Boebert was ever going to be that different, because she seems like she was just awful for a long time. But she's able to speak to people who are disgusted with Democrats, because she says to other fellow working class people, she says, look how they betrayed you. I lost my home in the financial crisis.
Right.
They'll never help you. You need a gun. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that is actually less funny, but way more interesting than where I thought you were going, which was going to have something to do with her husband at the bowling alley.
That's my opening of the review, is about her husband at the bowling alley. We deal with that straight up, and then we talk about the serious stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, no, that is fascinating. All right, well, yeah, I'm going to go back to what I was working on, which is a article for this afternoon, which is an article for Jacobin about a friend of the show, Jordan Peterson, who who recently talked to Kyle Kulinski, and I think if you compare some of the things that Peterson says about Marx and Marxism and socialism, and the Kulinski one to the things that he said 3 years ago at the Zizek debate, I think it's possible that Peterson somehow knows even less about this than he did then. Like he had maybe the Communist Manifesto was fresher in his mind in 2019. He's forgotten even that now.
Oh, I think it was because he picked it up. He said he picked it up before the debate and looked at it. So that no, he's getting worse. He's getting much. The things he says now are dumber and dumber and dumber than the things.
Yeah, he's also gotten just more aggressively reactionary in his political views, right? I mean, the big thing in 2017, 2018, whatever it was, is that the was that people were going to force him to say pronouns, which was a little dumb, even then, right? And I don't think it took a genius to see that he was that it was a little bit disingenuous, right? I mean, if that was really his only objection to this anti-discrimination bill, C-16, was with this, that somehow, right, it was he was going to end up getting sent to pronoun jail, which for the record has not happened. But whatever, if that was the concern, then okay, why are you opposing it? Why aren't you just supporting an amendment to make clear, right? That to like specifically targeted for the free speech issue. But like in the Klitzky thing, I mean, he goes way further than that. I mean,
Yeah, I know.
He at least toys with the idea of banning medical transition even for adults.
Yeah.
So
no, every time I hear him now, it's just like, oh my God, you've gone a little further into, I don't think taking a lot of drugs was good for him.
Yeah, there you go. No, I think it was.
We got an ad in the new current affairs called Jordan Peterson Life Coach, and it's like, hey, do you want to, and it's like how to keep your room clean, how to stay off drugs, how to be like cheerful and happy, how to listen to other people, how to be well groomed, and it's all like things that are just like not true of his wreck of a life.
Yeah, no, I mean, he obviously does exude happiness, and anybody who's ever seen him in one of these knows how good he is at listening to people.
Life advice. That's the guy I want to tell me how to be like well-adjusted and happy.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
I'll see you, man.
I will see you, Nathan. We will be off. Main show will be off on Monday. We are going to be back. So we're going to do. So the show's not going to happen on Monday. There's some family stuff, but we are going to do another of these breakdowns next Thursday. Matt McManus is going to be here. We are, in fact, finally going to finish Klitzky Peterson. And then the following Monday, the 15th, the main show will be back. We are going to have Jason Miles and Dr. Kuba for the first half of the show, and the great Anna Kasparian for the second. And Matt Huber in the post game. So should be a lot of fun all around. I will see you then. Left is best.